Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So this is the California and Oregon LCFS update, the part of this track of the NACW conference with the LCFS track that they've added over the past few years and expanded upon. So if you're looking for LCFS, you're in the right place. If you're looking for Philip Sheehy, he was originally on the schedule to speak. He had a prior commitment, wasn't able to make it today. So I'm your moderator. I'm Jordan Godwin. I'm with the OPIS Oil Price Information Services. We just provide news and pricing on various energy markets, including LCFS credits and these carbon markets. So, and I'm pleased today to have on this panel Mr. Jim Duffy. He's the Transportation Fuels Branch Chief and oversees California's LCFS program. And Ms. Cory-Ann, she's the program manager of the Oregon Clean Fuels Program, Oregon's version of the LCFS at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. So they're going to give us kind of an update on their respective programs, and then hopefully we can have a kind of Q&A discussion from there. So welcome, Jim and Cory-Ann.
Thank you, Jordan. So as Jordan said, I'm the chief of the Transportation Fuels Branch at CARB, and I just started that position as of Monday, so brand new. Don't be too hard on me. In this rather short presentation, I just want to give you a brief view on, the current status of California's program, talk a little bit about some changes we made in 2018 and the status of those changes, and then very briefly talk about next steps. So if there's any of you in the room that are not familiar with how a low-carbon fuel standard works, I'll give you kind of a brief 101 here. So the primary goal of the low-carbon fuel standard is to reduce the carbon intensity, the average carbon intensity of transportation fuels. And the carbon intensity is a measure of the total life cycle emissions associated with not only using the transportation fuel, but also producing and transporting that transportation fuel. And the units on carbon intensity are grams CO2 emissions per megajoule of that fuel, energy content of that fuel that's provided to the vehicle. The dotted line on this particular graph represents the carbon intensity emission reduction targets for California. And as you see, in 2018, we had a 5% carbon intensity reduction goal. And just in this last amendment cycle, we extended our reduction goals through 2030 to a 20% carbon intensity reduction. And so how does the program work? Well, those fuels that have a carbon intensity above that benchmark generate deficits. And the number of deficits is proportional to the volume of the fuel and the distance between the carbon intensity of that fuel and the benchmark carbon intensity. And then conversely, those fuels that have a carbon intensity below that standard generate credits. And again, the number of those credits is proportional to both the volume and the difference between the benchmark and the actual carbon intensity of that fuel. And so those entities that generate deficits, they come into compliance with our regulation by matching their number of deficits with an equal number of credits. And that sets up the credit market whereby they must either produce or blend sufficient fuels in order to achieve their average carbon intensity, or they must purchase credits from other alternative fuel producers. And so the progress for California's low-carbon fuel standard, this slide includes two breakdowns. On the left, it shows volumes of alternative fuels over time, and the right-hand side figure shows the corresponding number of credits generated by those fuels. And just so you know, a credit within the low-carbon fuel standard represents 1 metric ton of GHG emission reduction. As you can see by these figures, the California Alternative Fuel Pool is diversifying. Early on in the program in 2011, the primary alternative fuel in California was ethanol. And as you can see, our latest full year of data is 2017, and in about 1 week we'll have 2018 data available. But based upon 2017 data, you can see significant increases in renewable diesel, biodiesel, renewable natural gas, and electricity use in California. Just to give you an indication, the total combined biodiesel and renewable diesel is over 500 million gallons a year now. And renewable natural gas makes up about 70% of the total natural gas that's used in transportation in California. This particular slide gives a snapshot of the LCFS credit market over time. And the red dashes on this represent the average credit price, monthly credit price, and you can read off those prices on the left-hand side axis, whereas the blue bars represent the number of credits transacted during a given month. As you can see, LCFS credit prices have fluctuated over time, but recently the credit price is very strong. Over the past year, credit prices have ranged between $100 and $190 per ton. And for context, in 2018, the total value of credits transacted in California's program was approximately $2 billion. So the next few slides, I would like to hit on some key changes that we made to California's program in last year's amendment cycle and the status of these provisions. First, during this recent rulemaking, a coalition of utilities and automakers came together to lay the groundwork for a statewide rebate for electric vehicles at the point of sale. This program is going to be funded exclusively by credits that the utilities receive for electric vehicle charging in the residences. And the coalition, rather than CARB, is currently developing this program. It's expected to roll out sometime towards the end of this year or early next year with a reward amount. Right now, they're estimating in the vicinity of $1,500 to $2,000 per vehicle. We're excited about this program and the potential for this program to continue to accelerate electric vehicle adoption in California. Traditionally, the low carbon fuel standard has provided credits for electric vehicles and for fuel cell electric vehicles based upon the quantity of electricity or hydrogen that's dispensed to the vehicles. But in order to provide some additional incentives for the rollout of infrastructure, and in particular hydrogen stations and DC fast charging, in this recent round of rulemaking, the board adopted a provision known as infrastructure crediting. The concept here is fairly simple. In addition to the credits that are generated for the quantity of fuel dispensed, which is indicated, quantity of fuel dispensed on that figure there is indicated by the yellow line. So credits generated based upon the quantity of fuel dispensed are indicated by the blue there. In addition to those credits, the LCFS program will now credit for the difference between the capacity of the station and the quantity dispensed, which is represented there by the green portion in that figure. This allowance is for eligible stations. There's a certain number of years that these eligible stations can receive these credits. And the whole intent of this particular provision is kind of get away from the chicken and the egg problem associated with station development, in that nobody's building stations because the vehicles aren't out there. In particular, the fuel cell electric vehicles are not on the roads. But nobody wants to buy the vehicles because the stations aren't available. And so The governor, through an executive order, asked us to use the LCFS to try to get more hydrogen stations and DC fast chargers built. We just recently approved the first batch of stations, and we're continuing to accept applications for both hydrogen stations and DC fast chargers under this program. In addition to the 2030 GHG reduction targets, and I talked about our schedule there that we have declining targets through 2030. We also must keep in mind 2050 state goals for GHG reduction. And the California Council on Science and Technology has found that almost all paths to our 2050 goals will probably involve carbon capture and sequestration. So as part of the recent amendments, we rolled out a fairly rigorous carbon capture and sequestration protocol that allows now for crediting of CCS projects under the low carbon fuel standard. And we particularly feel that this will be adopted by several different biofuel producers, but particularly the ethanol industry, where they've got a fairly concentrated stream of CO2. It's basically just CO2 and water coming off the fermentation vessels. So we estimate that a typical corn ethanol facility can reduce the carbon intensity by 40% using carbon capture and sequestration. And we expect to see the first applications under this protocol coming in this year. And then finally, in the last rulemaking, we amended the regulation to allow for alternative jet fuel producers to opt in to the program as credit generators. However, fossil jet fuel will not be a deficit generating fuel under the program. So it's basically we're just providing the carrot in the aviation industry to try to get the transition started from fossil jet to renewable jet. And the reason for this is that aviation is a significant and growing source of emissions, and there really aren't a lot of alternatives in the aviation industry other than liquid biofuels. Some planes potentially will be operated in the future on electricity or hydrogen, but for the large commercial airliners, liquid biofuels are likely going to be the alternative for emission reductions in the future. This decision was met with a lot of enthusiasm in the industry, and we're expecting to see alternative jet fuel being reported in the LCFS this year. So finally, some next steps. We're going to continue to keep a close eye on all of these provisions and make it a hallmark of our program that we present transparent data. And if you don't know about our program, we've got a data dashboard where we present a lot of information about volumes, credits generated by different fuels, different feedstock types, et cetera. In the first 4 months of 2019, we've been very busy. The 2018 LCFS amendments were approved fairly late last year, and so we've been really busy on developing the IT systems to accommodate those amendments, as well as developing guidance materials, et cetera, to allow for smooth transition of the program. And also the verification team is really busy preparing training materials, contacting potential verifiers in order to get them accredited under our program so that when verification or validation starts in 2020 and reported data verification starts in 2021, that we'll have sufficient verifiers within the program. And then lastly, we're continuing to work with other jurisdictions to help them implement similar low-carbon fuel standard programs. You'll hear from Cory in just a few minutes, but also Canada is currently developing a similar type program. The state of Washington is considering a program, and if they don't do so, then the Puget Sound area will likely be implementing a low carbon fuel standard program. So we'll continue to work with those jurisdictions and help them implement and develop and implement their programs. And thank you.
Thanks very much, Jim. Do we have any questions for Jim from the audience? I know I have one on the, I think you mentioned it a little bit, the proposed cost containment modifications. Could you touch on those a little bit, what that proposal means, and what kind of, I think the comment period is still ongoing, but what kind of feedback you might have gotten so far on that?
Yeah, so what Jordan's referencing to is on April 5th, we held an informal workshop to discuss cost containment within the California's program. And, we firmly believe that the current cost containment provisions are working. Up until now, the credit price has remained below what we consider the soft cap, which is the price ceiling that is enacted within what we call the credit clearance market. And that price ceiling is $200 a ton in 2016 dollars indexed for inflation. So this year it's about $213. So we believe that the current credit clearance market and cost containment mechanism is working, but the board realized during the recent rulemaking there was a lot of stakeholder feedback that as we get more and more aggressive targets, that cost containment mechanism may be tested. And so they directed staff to monitor the cost containment provision within the low carbon fuel standard and to suggest improvements if we feel necessary. So we started an informal dialogue with stakeholders to talk about cost containment. At that workshop, we briefly discussed the current credit clearance market and deficit banking provision and how that functions. We talked about advantages and potential disadvantages of a harder cap on credit prices within the low carbon fuel standard. And then we also put forth what we called a staffed concept of what we feel a harder cap could look like. And that particular concept included a hard price cap within the normal credit market plus some advancing of credits in those situations in which there's insufficient credits in an annual compliance in order for everybody to meet their obligations. And as Jordan said, we're still accepting comments on that. We've received some initial feedback. I would say that the portion on advancing credits was, for the most part, positively received. There were a few people that didn't like that provision, but a lot of people liked that particular suggestion. The concept of enacting a hard cap within the normal credit market met with a little bit mixed reviews as far as the letters that I've seen so far. But yeah, we're still looking at the feedback, and we will continue to take a look at that over the next few weeks and then decide what the next steps may be in that discussion.
Do you have any kind of timeline for what that implementation might look like?
Yeah, so I'm really not going to probably get into that because we haven't made a decision that we are going to go forward. Should we do so, that timeline would follow our normal rulemaking timeline, which involves quite a bit of public process. An economic analysis, a staff report, a 45-day comment period followed by board hearings, and then staff responding to comments, and that's never done quickly. So, should we go forward with this amendment cycle, we're looking at, on the order of, at least 9 months to a year probably before, anything could be finished.
I was surprised. I was following along on the webcast for that workshop, and when it moved to the Q&A part, there wasn't the same kind of uproar that there is to most new ideas, I guess. So I was assuming that the stakeholders, for the most part, were pretty pleased with how things lined up, I guess, in the proposal.
Yeah, I think the verdict is still out on that, but from early indications, I think it was positively received. I think a lot of the stakeholders acknowledge the potential need for more stability and maybe a firmer price cap. Just what form that takes is still up for debate, and we're seeing a lot of suggestions in the comment letters for some differences between what we proposed.
Any other questions for Jim? Oh, right here.
Yes, so this might be more of a basic question. I was just wondering, you mentioned the banking for the deficits. Is there a similar, I'm not sure what the extent of the banking is for deficits and if there's any for credits as well, and if the 2018 amendments actually changed that technique.
Yeah, so credit banking can occur both for credits and for deficits. Currently, the program has approximately 9 million banked credits, and credits, when they're generated, can be banked indefinitely by parties. So some parties, such as deficit-generating entities, may want to bank credits, for future compliance, and hold on to those credits until they need them. Credit-generating entities may want to bank credits, with the idea that credit prices will increase in the future, and hold on to them, until that happens. On the deficit side, deficit banking would only occur after what we call a credit clearance market occurs. So at the end of a given year, if an entity does not meet its obligation, does not come up with enough credits to match with its deficits, then we hold what is known as a credit clearance market. And the first thing we do is we ask those entities that have credits if they want to pledge credits into this market. If we have pledged credits and we have entities that need those credits, then those entities that need credits must buy what we call their pro rata share of the pledged credits. And if there are not enough pledged credits, then at that point, that entity is still in compliance with the regulation, but we put those excess deficits into what we call a deficit bank. And the entity has up to 5 years in order to clear those deficits with credits. And that bank, or that account, earns 5% interest per year. If at the end of 5 years they still haven't cleared those deficits, then they're out of compliance with the regulation and subject to a penalty of up to $1,000 per deficit.
Do we have another question in the back?
Yes. So the question was that that a few entities have a majority of the bank of credits, and we do put out a figure which shows the number of basically the percentage of the credit bank owned by different entities. And so it's basically a plot that shows how many entities own, let's say, between 10 and 15%, and how many entities own, between 20 and 25% of the bank. And there's a lot of entities that own somewhere between 0 and 1% of the bank. But there are, like she mentioned, there's a few entities that own, anywhere between 5, 10, up to 20% of that bank. We do keep track of that internally as to which entities are in each of those different positions. At this point, we're not concerned about what you may be considering like hoarding of credits or something along that line, where somebody's trying to get undue market power. And so, yeah, I guess that's about as much as I can say on that particular topic. But at this point, we don't see reason to be concerned.
Any other questions for Jim? Yeah.
Oh, could you say that question again?
Are you guys discussing at all allowing non-compliant entities to actually
Oh, so I think what he's referring to is that the LCFS, in order to participate within the market, you've got to have some position within the fuels market. So you have to be generating a fuel that is supplied to the California market. Now, once you get in, no matter what fuel that is, you can buy and sell credits and participate, within the market. We're not considering that at this point, allowing entities that do not have a position in the market. But if you would like to discuss that, and you have some really good reasons as to why we may want to allow that, we definitely are open to meeting with any stakeholders and listening to you, and then as part of a future rulemaking, you can definitely bring that up and see if there's any interest at that point.
All right, thank you. I think we'll move on to Cory-Ann's presentation on Oregon. Do we need to load it up, maybe? Switch.
Okay, is this one on too? Okay, okay. So, good afternoon, everyone. You stay awake after your lunch coma. I'm still working off this 5:30 a.m. flight this morning from Portland, so. But it's good to be able to have this opportunity to talk to you today about the Oregon Clean Fuels Program. So, like Jim was saying, is that Oregon is the second of the U.S. states to be implementing this policy. It's a bill that initially passed our Oregon legislature in 2009, but we spent several years designing a program customized for the state of Oregon. It's not exactly like the California program. I would say it's probably 90+% compared to California's, and obviously our legislators put in some safeguards and some customizations for Oregon. So I'll try and cover some of the major kind of differences between the Oregon and the California program. So as Jim mentioned earlier, we have our clean fuel standards in the state. Our baseline year is in 2015, so we began implementing the program in 2016. One of the differences in our baseline is Oregon has a renewable fuel standard that requires 10% ethanol, 5% biodiesel in our baseline fuels, and so our baseline considers those blending rates. So in some sense, like there are some people that have said, well, for the first 10% of the requirement for the LCFS, Oregon's standard was a little bit more stringent than California's. And that's true in as much as we've considered both 10% ethanol and 5% biodiesel blended into our all of our on-road fuels. But so we're in our 4th year of implementing the program right now. So in 2019, we're requiring 1.5% reductions from that baseline. This is data that we have through Q3 of 2018. We are on the same reporting periods as California, so the Q4 data was due into us at the end of March, and then the annual reports are due in at the end of April, which is why we're really busy auditing reports right now. So we'll have the Q4 data and the annual reporting data probably in a couple of weeks, in the middle of May. But it's, what this graph shows is that basically since the beginning of the program, quarter by quarter, we have had excess credits over the amount of deficits that have been generated into the Oregon program. There was a little blip in the 2018 in the Q2 report where there was a slight, I can't say the word, slightly more deficits that were generated than credits that were generated from that quarter. But I just remind you with this quarterly data, it's not compliance data, and there's lots of seasonal variations between the quarters. So in Q3 data, it's definitely shown that the credit generation has exceeded the deficit generation again. And the preliminary data that we've shown, that we've looked at for Q4 shows that there's excess credit generation as well. So there's about, at the end of 2018, there'll be about 500,000 credits banked in the Oregon program. One notable thing, so the fuel market in Oregon is about 10% the size of California, just to kind of give you a sense of scope. I think another important thing is that in Oregon, we don't actually have any refineries in state. And so all of our petroleum production comes from out of state and is imported into the state. We do have some biofuels production in state. But that's another big difference about how we regulate, the point of regulation for the program, where we focus on the importers of the fuel into the state of Oregon. So if you own the title to the fuels as it comes into Oregon, that's the point of regulation. And in that mechanism, so we get a lot of the very, very large oil companies that have position as importers, but we also have very, very small companies that participate. We have a large terminal that lies right across the border from Portland, Oregon, in Vancouver, Washington. And so every truckload of fuel that comes across the river, potentially different importers. And so, even though we have a market size that is 10th of California, we have about 160 regulated parties that we deal with, all the way from the multinational oil companies to some very small mom-and-pop jobbers that just, transport fuel across the border. In the California program, we do have a credit market for the Oregon program. These are unique to Oregon. The credits between Oregon and California are not fungible. So you can see here as well, the blue bars are the volumes of the credits that have been trading in the program, and the red line is your average monthly price. We publish the trades that are transacted on a monthly basis. One of the questions I get asked is that, when are we going to move to like a weekly report like California does? But, honestly, we don't have that volume of trading that goes on right now. So we'll stick to the monthly. If the volume of trading picks up, then we can also consider going to a more frequent reporting. For the month of March, the average credit prices were about $145. So you can see that there's a pretty steep increase in activity of the credit trading that went on in 2018. Still lower than what California is, but definitely the activity in Oregon is picking up. This is just a slide that I kind of did as a background slide. I know you had asked a question about kind of the credit clearance market. We also, in Oregon, also have a credit clearance market that we run. And so just to kind of give you, kind of the mechanics of how this works, all the regulated parties are required to demonstrate their compliance for 2018 by the end of April 2019. And so at that point, it's whether there are any regulated parties that still need to buy additional credits, that they haven't, reconciled all of their deficits. And so this is just the timing of it. So in the month of April, we've already put out a call to all of our credit generators. It says, hey, does anybody want to pledge credits into the market? We have a soft cap on these credit amounts too. For 2018 dollars, it's $200. And then it's increased by CPI increase on an annual basis. So for 2016, we're talking about $206. And so we'll have a call for these credits pledged into the market. And then by May 15th, we'll know by all of the submissions of the annual reports whether there's some of the parties that actually need to get additional credits in the market or not. And we'll go through this process. If nobody needs it, then we'll release the credits back to the entities that have pledged the credits into the market, and then they're free to transact them on the open market. Like California, we were in rulemaking last year. Actually, for those of you that follow the Oregon program, we're in rulemaking pretty much every year. Instead of kind of taking big chunks of the regulation and doing, longer process rulemakings, we tend to take little chunks at a time and do some smaller rule changes or to piggyback on things that California has done. And so in 2018, the main things that we changed in our regulations, updated the models that we use to calculate the carbon intensities, so both OPG. So OPG is used for the crude, before the refinery upstream emissions. So we updated that to version 2.0. We also upgraded the GREET model for the rest of the life cycle of the fuels to the 3.0, so that aligns us with the California models right now. So that is, it's good for those models to be aligned, because the way that we implement the program in Oregon is if there's a producer that has a carbon intensity that is approved by the state of California, that entity just needs to submit that approved pathway to the state of Oregon. And all you have to do is adjust the transportation distance from the facility to the state of Oregon instead. And so you don't have to go back and redo the whole pathway application. You just do the adjustments. And so then it really facilitates us to be able to process that much more quickly. And because in Oregon too, so there's 3.5 FTE that implement the program right now. So there's definitely these efficiencies that we've baked into the process to actually make it more efficient. We did also include some new credit generation categories for the state. And again, this kind of piggybacks on work that California did even previous to 2018. But the addition of forklifts, so both propane and hydrogen and electric forklifts, the TRUs and the truck stop electrification units, so all of those using electricity can generate credits within the system. We also added in the new fuels to actually generate credits into the Oregon program as well. So it's renewable propane as well as alternative jet. Same logic that Jim presented as far as adding those products to the market. We have seen them come into the renewable propane entering the Oregon market, as well as a new alternative jet facility being built in the state of Oregon. So I think that's definitely something that we needed to consider adding to the program. And so next steps for us. We are very busily looking at the last of the quarterly reports and annual reports for 2018. Like I said, we've looked at some preliminary data. We feel confident that all of the regulated parties are going to be able to be in compliance for this year. There is an excess bank of credits in Oregon still yet, and so we're very much kind of like in this implementation mode of moving forward with the program. In general, we see the ethanol and the biodiesel continuing to lower in carbon intensity, increasing amounts of renewable diesel into Oregon, and increasing numbers of EVs with generating electricity credits in the state as well. So Oregon is a 177 state, so we are definitely seeing an uptick in the amount of electric vehicles. And we've, in 2018, also instituted a brand new Oregon rebate for the purchase of new electric vehicles. And so in the second half of 2018, we really saw a nice increase in the sales of EVs into Oregon. And we anticipate that will continue on its upward growth as well. The next rulemaking, so we do have a rulemaking that we have signaled that we're going to begin in 2018. We're not going to finish it in 2018. It'll probably go into 2019. And the next two big pieces that we're looking at is adopting third-party verification, as has already been adopted in California. And so as it applies to pathways that come into Oregon, as well as the quarterly reports that are submitted to the state. The part of the reason why we delayed in the rulemaking in this is, as you probably all know, there's discussions going on in our state legislature about a new cap-and-trade program for the state of Oregon. So in as much as third-party verification overlaps both cap-and-trade programs as well as LCFS programs, we decided to wait and see what the outcome of that discussion in the legislature is this year, and then tailor whatever rulemaking, whatever work that the agency will have to do, based on the outcome of that. And then as well as, as Jim mentioned, to the work that they're doing to get all the trainings done for third-party verification, we'll be able to take advantage of that as well too. Because it's very likely that if you have a pathway or reports that are verified in California, we'll be able to accept that in Oregon as well. And then the other thing that he mentioned as well, CCS protocol. We have been approached with facilities that have CCS as part of their pathways into the state of Oregon too. There are a few pathways producers actually that do send directly into Oregon and not into both Oregon and California. So in as much as we can piggyback on the pathways that California has approved for the fuels that are going to California, we do some unique pathways in Oregon because some come directly to us. And so in that sense, we have had proposals for CCS and for some of those facilities as well. And so we'll be working on lining up that protocols. Okay. I think that's it.
All right, good deal. Questions for Cory-Ann? Right here.
Well, it's not at all clear that biofuels from forest products are carbon neutral. And corn ethanol, I'm from the Midwest, corn ethanol has been a disaster in terms of land use change, water quality impact. So I think you guys are a little glib in asserting that biofuels are the solution. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, from my perspective, I think it is part of the solution. When we do our life cycle assessments, we do include indirect land use change values as part of that carbon intensity value. So, I think there's a lot of argument as far as what number is the exact number to assess, but there definitely is a penalty that's considered into that carbon intensity.
Well, I would assert that land use change is larger than has been estimated by GREET.
Yeah, so, just kind of piggybacking off what Cory-Ann said, California's program does include indirect land use change, which, provides a disadvantage to those biofuels that are based exclusively, straight from crops. And, you can really see the difference with respect to renewable diesel and biodiesel in California. Nearly all of it is considered more waste-based, so that it's used cooking oil, tallow-based, used cooking renewable diesel and biodiesel versus the virgin vegetable oils like canola or soy or palm, which have all have significant land use change adders to their carbon intensity. So at least on that side, it is providing that difference and driving more towards the waste-based solutions. Your comment about forest products potentially having emissions, yes, that is true, and it all depends upon whether you're talking about forest waste residues versus actual cutting of trees and using forest products, and the life cycle assessment will be different based upon what is that particular feedstock, and whether it's considered more of a residue or waste versus purposely grown trees or clearing of natural forests. And so we try to do the best we can to take that into account and to try to drive the market towards more of those residue or waste-based feedstocks. But again, as Cory-Ann said, even if we do have that land use change adder, you can say that that it should be higher. There should be more of a disadvantage, whereas others will provide evidence that it should be lower. And the science is improving, but there's a lot of different variables associated with doing those land use change calculations, and it's extremely complex. And so we hope that the signal that we provide is helpful, but do we have the number right? No, but we're trying to do the best we can to provide that signal.
Do we have a question here?
Well, thank you for that very concise overview. I have a question on the graph that you showed on the credit balances. The price keep going up, and that to me doesn't seem. What are your thoughts on that? Because that doesn't seem to make sense, because the bank is growing, the balance is you have a surplus. Why does the price keep going up?
Yeah, you're talking specifically about the Oregon prices. Yeah, I get my interpretation of what I hear from the market participants is that so we're in year 4 of our program now, and we're only authorized to reduce 10% out to 2025. And the regulated parties have definitely told us that they think it's going to be very, very difficult for the state of Oregon to meet the 10% reductions. And so they're planning for the future. So there isn't a large, there is a bank. It is not a large bank. And I think that's why you're seeing just continuing increase in the price. The market's tighter in Oregon than it is in California.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that. California's bank, like I said, is about 9 million credits in the bank. In 2019, we're expecting deficits to be on the order of 14-15 million, and they'll be increasing every year. And so, it is an indication of supply and demand, where people aren't just looking at the current year supply and demand, but they're looking out into the future, and with the more and more aggressive targets in the future and what they see as alternative fuel availability and credit generating project availability, they may be seeing a tight market in the future, and therefore the prices are reflecting that.
So as both California and Oregon appear to be heading towards a period in which deficits are being generated, where do you anticipate those new low-carbon intensity fuels are going to come from? At least in California, there's already a 10% ethanol cap on fuel. There are limits in technology and the ability to produce at scale the kinds of fuels that we needed to meet this market demand.
Yeah, and I'll say I'm cautiously optimistic. about the ability of alternative fuel producers and credit generating entities to meet that demand. As I showed the credit price history of California's program, there were some times there where we had some really low credit prices between 2013 and 2015, credit prices between $20 and $30 a ton, which weren't sufficient to drive anybody to do investments. And that was a period in which California was dealing with a lawsuit, and we had to readopt the regulation. We did so in 2015. And as you saw, if you looked at that credit price history, around that time, credit prices started going back up. And they've continued to go up until, now they're in the $180 range. And recently we've seen a fairly stable, strong credit price. And I think that signal is, as long as we can maintain that stability within the program, is going to drive the investment. Where do we see that coming from? Obviously, renewable diesel is one of the big areas we see that coming from. Diamond Green, has an announcement of doubling the size of their facility. Neste, the same thing. World Energy bought the Paramount refinery in California. They're converting that petroleum refinery to a renewable diesel production. Refinery was purchased in North Dakota, and they're going to convert that to renewable diesel production. So renewable diesel production is one area where we see continued growth. Biodiesel, the same. It's been a little bit slower than renewable diesel, part because of some underground storage tank limitations in California that they're working out. But when that gets worked out, we feel that has more potential. But beyond the liquid biofuels, you mentioned ethanol has a blend limit of 10%. But I did talk about carbon capture and sequestration, and we feel that is a big opportunity for ethanol to reduce carbon intensity and increase credit generation. But beyond those liquid biofuels, renewable natural gas, and particularly dairy gas, which has a large negative carbon intensity owing to the avoided methane emissions rather than avoiding CO2 emissions, that can be a very big credit generator in the future. But then couple that with electricity. Electricity is going to continue to grow. California has goals of 5 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030. And that number of vehicles will generate a significant number of credits within the program. But there are also opportunities within the petroleum fuels themselves that haven't necessarily been taken advantage of in the past, but we have done some amendments to help make those more likely. So refinery investment credit provision, renewable hydrogen for refineries, and innovative crude provision. And in fact, we just saw a recent announcement not announcement, but an application from Glass Point Solar to build a solar steam facility in the Central Valley of California. The phase one of that project will generate about 150,000 credits annually. When they get that full project implemented, it's going to be on the order of 350,000 credits annually. So there are those opportunities out there. Now, the question is, will the investments and will the development of those facilities come at a fast enough pace to match the rising number of deficits? And like I said, I'm cautiously optimistic on that.
Yeah, I think just the one thing that I would add to what Jim said too, it's, very bullish on the electric vehicles, and, the states have complementary policies to make that electricity like renewable as well. So it's the carbon intensity of the electricity as well, in addition to the increasing number of EVs.
I think we have time for one more question.
So what he's referring to is, as part of the recent amendments, we added flexibility on the electricity side so that Previously, if you were going to use renewable electricity to charge an electric vehicle, the renewable electricity had to be right there at the charging unit. And we realized that, that's very difficult, especially for urban areas, to have on-site solar or wind or whatever. So we allow now indirect matching of renewable electricity to charging events through a book and claim accounting system. And we're using the Regis accounting system, and that, they've got the renewable electricity will generate a REC. That REC has to be purchased by the owner of the charging equipment and retired into a low carbon fuel standard sub-account. So it can't be used under the renewable portfolio standard. With respect, I lost track of your question there.
I was asking what type of
Oh, yes. Yeah, so those particular RECs have to be, the renewable electricity either has to be supplied to the grid within California, or if it's produced outside of California, it has to meet the portfolio content category 1 deliverability requirements to California. So it has to be scheduled into a California balancing authority.
And with that, I think we're out of time. So please help me, and thank you, Cory-Ann and Jim.